Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really intriguing idea today, pulled from this stack of sources you've brought. It fundamentally challenges how most of us think about failure, about problems, maybe even tragedy.
It really does. What's fascinating here, and it definitely requires a significant perspective shift, is moving beyond just thinking about an individual, a single unit surviving stress.
Right.
Instead, it's about how larger systems can actually benefit, precisely because individual parts don't survive or because they fail.
That's the core concept we're really wrestling with in this material, isn't it? It's not the usual kind of anti-fragility where, you as an individual entity get stronger from stress, like lifting weights builds muscle, or your immune system fighting off a virus after a vaccine.
Exactly. The sources actually call those simpler examples, maybe weaker forms, or even proto-anti-fragility.
Why weak forms?
Well, because those examples focus entirely on the same unit that faced the stressor becoming more robust as a direct result. The organism or the specific system segment adapts and strengthens itself directly. It's contained.
But this deep dive, based on this stack of articles, notes, and transcripts, it gets into something more layered, more complex, and frankly, maybe a little unsettling.
hmm
It's this idea that the fragility, sometimes the outright failure or even the demise of some units within a system isn't just a side effect, but is actually necessary for the anti-fragility, the overall strength, the evolution, the improvement of the system as a whole.
Yes, this layered anti-fragility, or as the source material sometimes puts it, anti-anti-fragility,
Yeah.
it's characterized by this transfer of benefits. The lessons learned, the information gained, maybe even the necessary space or resources created by the failure they often get conferred upon those who survive, or those who adapt, or who come later.
So the entity experiencing the stress or failure doesn't necessarily get stronger itself.
Frequently not. The
Yeah.
collective, or perhaps a higher level in the system's hierarchy, that's what benefits.
And we've got this pretty dense stack of material that explores this idea across, well, a huge range of domains, everything from the kind of brutal efficiency of nature and evolution
Right.
to the dynamics of human engineering and safety systems, economics, even financial markets.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to act as your guides through all this.
Hmm.
We want to try and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, understand this sometimes counterintuitive concept of, well, profiting from the errors and failures of others, and distill what it truly means for the complex systems we're all part of.
And maybe even for how we view risk and learning in our own lives.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, let's unpack that core idea then, because the source material really doesn't pull any punches. It presents this incredibly powerful, almost brutal statement right up front: what kills me makes others stronger. That's not just like a catchy phrase, is it? It sounds like the foundational principle here.
It absolutely is. It cuts right to the heart of it. It's forcing a recognition that anti-fragility isn't this, uniform property that blankets an entire system equally.
Yeah.
Instead, the source emphasizes that anti-fragility for one entity within a system very often implies, or maybe even requires, fragility for another entity, usually operating at a different scale or level of organization within that same system.
And this is where it goes beyond those simpler ideas we mentioned earlier, like getting stronger after a small dose of poison hormesis or a vaccine, mithridation. The source specifically labels those weak forms or proto-antifragility. Can you elaborate a bit more on why that distinction is so important?
Certainly. In those cases, like hormesis or mithridation, the same unit that is subjected to the stressor is the one that benefits directly. Your immune system fights the weakened virus from a vaccine and becomes stronger against that specific virus.
Okay.
Your muscle fiber is stressed by lifting weights and rebuilds stronger within that same muscle. The adaptation and strengthening happen within the individual unit experiencing the challenge. It's a direct feedback loop.
But the type of anti-fragility described in this material has the source calls a hitch. It's largely about errors of others. The benefit of the failure or the harm isn't necessarily localized to the unit that experienced it.
Precisely. The failure or error of one unit becomes essentially information. It's a lesson learned, or it creates a corrective pressure that disproportionately benefits the collective or other units within the system, and often tragically, not the one who failed.
Hmm.
This information transfer, this lesson learned through failure, that is the core of the anti-fragility emerging at a higher level.
And this seems to be where the concept of layering and hierarchies becomes really critical. Systems aren't monolithic. They're composed of subunits, right? And those systems themselves might be subunits of even larger collectives.
Absolutely. The source even notes that these subunits can be contending with each other,
Yeah.
which adds another layer of complexity to it all.
So that hierarchical structure is key.
It's absolutely crucial for understanding where the fragility lies and where the anti-fragility resides. Often the necessary fragility is concentrated at a lower level, the individual unit, the specific component, the single instance, let's say.
Okay.
And this allows for the anti-fragility to emerge at a higher, more encompassing level. The species, the industry as a whole, the entire market, the collective knowledge base.
Yeah.
The breakdown of the smaller part serves essentially to strengthen the larger whole.
Right. So stepping back and looking at nature, so sources present evolution as the absolute, undeniable, prime example of this layered anti-fragility in action. It seems to be the blueprint for how this concept works, almost.
It really is. I mean, if you look at the individual organism, you, me, a bacterium, a tree, we are all inherently fragile. We're born, we live for a limited time, and eventually we die. We're subject to injury, disease, environmental threats.
Yeah, that's us.
But what is anti-fragile, fundamentally, is the information encoded in the genes, the genetic code itself. That information reproduces, often with modifications, carrying forward the lessons, you could call them, of which genetic variations were successful in the face of environmental stressors and which were not.
It's quite a harsh reality when you frame it like that, isn't it? Individual organisms must die. They must experience failure when confronted by their environment for nature at the genetic or species level to be anti-fragile, to adapt and persist.
It is harsh. The source doesn't mince words here, describing nature in this context as opportunistic, ruthless, and selfish.
Selfish, how so?
That selfishness is central to the mechanism. The genetic code, in a sense, doesn't really care about the welfare of the unit itself, meaning the individual organism. Its priority, if you can call it that, is the successful replication and adaptation of the information it carries, even if that means the individual carrying it perishes. The individual is essentially disposable from this perspective. The genetic line carrying the learned adaptations, that's what is being preserved and strengthened over time.
Wow. The examples from the source really drive this point home, illustrating how individual tragedy becomes collective learning. Like, imagine that early human ancestor foraging. They come across a new plant, maybe it looks appealing, they try it, and it turns out to be poisonous. They die. That is obviously a devastating loss for that individual and maybe their immediate family. Their specific gene pool might end right there.
Exactly. A moment of extreme fragility for that individual. But by observing their fate, what happens? The rest of the tribe gains invaluable, potentially life-saving information.
Ah, I see. They learn. Don't eat that plant.
Precisely. They learn to avoid that particular plant. This lesson is then passed down, maybe through stories, warnings, traditions. The genetic lines of the survivors implicitly carry this new knowledge, and the collective knowledge base of the tribe or species is strengthened. The death of that one individual, while tragic, directly confers anti-fragility onto the rest and future generations.
Or the other example, the great-grandparent, as the source puts it, hunted by a wild animal. Their life is cut short, violently. Again, individual tragedy.
Right.
But the circumstances of that attack, maybe how they tried to evade it, the type of animal involved, the terrain, all this information passed down through generations teaches survival lessons. Lessons that benefit the entire civilization over centuries.
The information transfer is the key point. The lessons get encoded not just genetically, sometimes, but also culturally and behaviorally.
So there's this constant inherent tension built into the system then. Nature, at the higher level of the gene pool or species, thrives on individual death, variation, turnover, because these are the engines of selection and adaptation.
Yes.
Meanwhile, individual organisms, like us, are biologically programmed with a powerful drive to survive as long as possible, to avoid being the sacrificial unit.
That tension is absolutely fundamental to understanding how the system works. And the source uses a fascinating thought experiment to highlight why this individual fragility is necessary for systemic anti-fragility. Imagine an immortal organism.
An immortal organism. It sounds pretty good initially.
It does sound appealing on the surface, right?
What?
Infinite life. But think about the implications in a world of constant, unpredictable change. To survive indefinitely, this immortal organism would theoretically need to be perfectly fit for all possible future random events in its environment, no matter how unexpected or novel.
Right. And the whole point of true randomness is that it doesn't announce itself. You can't predict exactly what the next big environmental shock will be: a new virus, a sudden climate shift, a new predator appearing.
Exactly. So for an immortal being, if a truly novel random event occurs for which it wasn't already perfectly pre-adapted, It's fundamentally vulnerable. There's no mechanism for generational adaptation because there are no new generations.
Ah, okay, so nature avoids this impossible prediction problem.
It seems so. Instead of trying to engineer perfect, immortal organisms that can withstand anything forever, it creates organisms with limited lifespans. This allows for continuous turnover of generations.
Which enables change.
Right. Change through random mutations or copying mistakes in the genes, which create variation, and change through the selection process driven by the environment. Each generation gets tested by the randomness it encounters during its lifespan.
And the successful variations, those traits that allowed survival and reproduction in that environment, form the basis for the next generation.
Exactly. So every random event, every environmental stressor encountered by a generation becomes, in a way, its own antidote. It drives a response, a selection pressure, leading to ecological or biological variation in the subsequent generations. Nature doesn't need to predict the future perfectly. It adapts in response to the present and the past through this cycle of fragile lives.
So this is precisely why evolution actually loves stressors, randomness, uncertainty, disorder from a systemic perspective anyway.
Yes. While they cause fragility and death at the individual organism level, these forces are the drivers of the selection process. They are the information signals that the gene pool uses, essentially, to test and enhance its overall fitness over time.
And the source highlights that evolution benefits from randomness in two main ways. First, there's the randomness within the genetic code itself, those spontaneous changes, mutations, copying mistakes that create variation.
Yes, those mutations provide the raw material for selection. Most might be neutral or even harmful to the individual carrying them, but occasionally one provides an unexpected advantage in a particular environment.
And the second way?
The second is the randomness in the environment itself. Sudden shifts in climate, the introduction of new diseases, geological events like volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts. Unstable conditions act as powerful filters, pushing aside less fit descendants, as the source says, and rapidly favoring those with genetic traits better suited to the new challenges.
So even something as seemingly catastrophic as a mass extinction event, from this perspective, it's still evolution at work.
It is, from that high-level long-term view. While it eliminates many species, the fitter species, those perhaps better equipped to survive the new conditions or exploit the changed ecosystem, persist and diversify, eventually filling the ecological vacuum left by the lost ones.
So evolution, in this context, is seen as being at the service of the whole of nature, focused on the resilience and diversity of the biosphere itself, not really on the preservation of any single species indefinitely.
That seems to be the argument, and you can see this principle operating even at a smaller scale, within populations of organisms, not just species over vast geological time.
Like antibiotic resistance in bacteria, the source uses that as a powerful analogy. Right?
Exactly. It's a perfect contemporary example. When you introduce an antibiotic into a bacterial population, you're applying a massive stressor.
Right, you kill most of them.
You do. The weaker, less resistant individual bacteria die. That's fragility at the individual bacterium level on a massive scale. But inevitably, some individuals might have slight genetic mutations that confer even a tiny bit of resistance. They survive.
And they're the ones that reproduce.
Precisely. So the population that emerges after the antibiotic exposure is far more resistant, far more anti-fragile to that specific antibiotic than the original population was. The population became stronger at the direct expense of the countless individual members that were killed off.
It's the same mechanism we sometimes see, tragically, in cancer therapy too, isn't it?
It is. Chemotherapy or radiation often targets rapidly dividing cells. Many cancer cells are killed. That's the intended individual fragility. But often, a few cells within the tumor have pre-existing genetic variations that make them resistant to the treatment.
The tough ones survive.
Those resistant cells survive and then proliferate, sometimes leading to a relapse with a tumor that is now much harder to treat because the weaker, susceptible cells have been eliminated, leaving only the stronger, resistant ones to multiply. The cancer cell population effectively becomes anti-fragile to the therapy by sacrificing its most fragile members.
It's a micro-level illustration of the exact same principle. Leveraging the fragility and death of subunits, individual bacteria, individual cancer cells, to confer robustness and anti-fragility on the larger collective, the bacterial population, the tumor itself.
It really underscores the universality of the concept.
Okay, so let's shift gears now from the brutal efficiency of nature to human-engineered systems and societal structures. The source suggests the same fundamental principle benefiting from failure. Often the failure of others is still at play, but maybe with human intentions and, well, consequences layered on top.
Yes, Because in systems that we design, errors, while they cause failure, also crucially provide information. If you approach them rationally, every trial that fails, every error that's made, is a source of invaluable data about what does not work.
It narrows down the possibilities.
Exactly. It points you towards the correct path, or at least away from the wrong ones. And this is key, only if that information is actually captured, understood, and utilized effectively by the system.
And echoing that core idea again, this particular part of the source material really emphasizes how the mistakes of others are often what provide this crucial information, conferring a benefit upon the rest of us. And tragically, the person or entity who made the mistake is frequently not the beneficiary of the lesson learned.
This is perhaps most starkly, and I'd say undeniably, illustrated in the domain of aviation safety. The source holds this up as a prime example of a system that is remarkably anti-fragile, improving continuously over decades, precisely because its individual units, the specific flights, the individual planes, and tragically, the people aboard them, are fragile and occasionally prone to catastrophic failure.
It's a deeply difficult truth to confront, isn't it? But the argument is compelling. Every single plane crash, as devastating and final as it is for those directly involved, makes the entire system of air travel safer for everyone else who flies afterward.
That's the mechanism described. The sources point to specific historical accidents as examples. The IGJ accident in 1985, which highlighted critical issues with maintenance practices and pressure bulkheads,
I remember reading about that.
or Swissair Flight 111 in '98, the fire caused by wiring issues, which led to widespread changes in insulation materials and onboard fire suppression systems. Or Air France 447 in 2009, the loss over the Atlantic, which exposed complex issues with automation reliance, pitot tubes icing over, and pilot training for high-altitude upsets.
These weren't just isolated incidents then. They were, in a sense, involuntary catastrophic experiments.
That's one way to look at it. And the learning that happens afterward is incredibly rigorous, as the source describes. When a crash occurs, every component, every procedure is scrutinized. Regulatory bodies like the FAA here, EASA in Europe, the DGCA in other regions, they launch exhaustive investigations.
Aircraft manufacturers too, right? Boeing, Airbus.
Absolutely. They analyze the flight data recorders, the cockpit voice recorders, the wreckage itself, leading often to redesigns of components, software updates, changes in operational recommendations. Airlines revise their training protocols. Air traffic control and airport authorities review their procedures. Even fire brigades learn how to respond better.
Which leads to that difficult, unsettling conclusion presented in the source. Those who perished in these accidents are, in a very real and profound sense, unwilling sacrifices for the greater good of aviation safety.
It's a hard statement, but that's the argument. Their deaths triggered the investigations, revealed the critical, previously unknown or underestimated flaws, and spurred the systemic changes that prevent future accidents of the same type. In the cold calculus of statistics, their loss arguably saves more lives over the subsequent decades that were lost in the initial tragedy.
So every crash, from this system's perspective, adds a layer of hard-won knowledge, bringing the entire industry closer to an ideal state of safety by eliminating previously unknown failure modes. It learns from its fatal errors.
Yes, the system learns. And the same principle, though maybe less immediately visible in its benefit sometimes, applies to other major engineering disasters, like the sinking of the Titanic back in 1912.
How so?
Well, the source argues that while the loss of life was immense and tragic, think about what might have happened had the Titanic not struck that iceberg and sunk. We might have continued building ever larger, ever faster ocean liners under the assumption they were truly unsinkable.
Hubris, basically.
Possibly, leading perhaps to an even more catastrophic disaster down the line, maybe involving multiple ships colliding, or a single, even larger vessel carrying thousands more people hitting an iceberg under similar circumstances. The tragedy of 1912 provided a brutal, undeniable lesson about the limits of technology and our assumptions in the face of nature's power.
And that led to concrete changes.
Yes, significant changes in shipping regulations, the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, requirements for sufficient lifeboats for everyone on board, 24-hour radio watches, things that fundamentally improved maritime safety and likely prevented greater future loss.
And similarly with nuclear safety, the source mentions Fukushima.
Right. The Fukushima Daiichi disaster in 2011, triggered by that massive earthquake and subsequent tsunami, exposed critical vulnerabilities in reactor design and emergency procedures, particularly concerning the reliability of backup power and cooling systems when faced with extreme, beyond design basis, natural events.
A terrible event.
Absolutely, with long-lasting consequences. But that event provided a global, stark lesson. Investigations led to reassessments of seismic and flooding risks, mandated improvements in backup power systems, hardened vents, and enhanced safety protocols for nuclear plants worldwide. It helped prevent potentially larger catastrophes in other locations by identifying and forcing mitigation of previously underestimated risks. Again, a tragic failure at the unit level, providing crucial information for the entire global system.
This perspective, though, it requires a truly profound and, let's be honest, incredibly difficult shift in how we process tragedy, especially for those directly affected. The source acknowledges this deeply human challenge, right?
It does. It uses the example of a grieving family after a plane crash. Their loss is absolute. There is no upside for them personally. They are in shock, dealing with unimaginable pain, possibly grappling with PTSD for years, and may understandably lash out, blaming pilots, the airline, the manufacturers, regulators, anyone. Their focus is, correctly and understandably, on the individual human cost.
From their individual human perspective, the tragedy is singular, it's irrecoverable, they will never fully recover from that loss.
Never. But, as the source suggests, from a systems perspective, which is framed as a right enough perspective for understanding how these large, complex systems behave, however emotionally difficult it might be for us to adopt the death of their loved one as part of that specific crash, triggered a chain reaction.
A chain reaction of investigation, learning, improvement.
Exactly. Improvements in aviation science, technology, procedures, training improvements that will, statistically speaking, save potentially millions of future lives by preventing other similar accidents down the road.
So it highlights this stark, unavoidable conflict between the raw, individual human experience of profound loss and the abstract, statistical, often unseen benefit conferred upon the collective or the system as a whole over time.
It does. It doesn't lessen the tragedy for the individual one bit, but it helps explain a powerful, if sometimes uncomfortable mechanism driving progress and safety improvements in complex, high-risk systems.
Okay, let's move into economic systems now. We see variations of this layered anti-fragility and the role of failure playing out there too, sometimes in ways that are kind of counterintuitive to our usual desire for stability and predictability.
Indeed. The source returns to this simple, everyday example of restaurants to illustrate a point. Think about the restaurant scene in any city or town. Individual restaurants are almost designed to be fragile, particularly in the face of competition.
They open, they close.
Right. They open, they compete fiercely based on quality, price, service, concept, location, and many, maybe even most in the long run, fail.
And when they fail, what's the systemic effect?
Well, that failure provides information, doesn't it? To the surviving restaurants and maybe even more importantly, to aspiring new restaurant owners. Others learn from their mistakes. Perhaps the location was bad, the menu wasn't appealing, the prices were too high or too low, the service was poor, the management inefficient.
So the competition weeds out the weak and teaches the others.
Essentially, yes. This competitive pressure, fueled by the real possibility of failure and the lessons learned from those failures, drives adaptation and improvement among the survivors. The collective local restaurant scene. The environment of dining options available to you becomes anti-fragile. It gets better, more diverse, more responsive to customer demand because individual restaurants are allowed, even expected, to fail.
So following that logic, if individual restaurants were somehow made robust, maybe heavily subsidized or protected from competition,
The source argues you'd likely end up with a stagnant, weak system overall. Without the pressure of potential failure, and without the valuable information those failures provide, there's much less incentive to innovate, to improve quality, to control costs, or to adapt to changing tastes.
you get complacency.
Exactly. The source colorfully compares this hypothetical situation to potentially ending up with something like Soviet-style cafeteria food, consistently mediocre, perhaps with systemic shortages or inefficiencies, because the individual units lack the necessary fragility to drive systemic improvement and responsiveness.
And this leads directly into a pretty strong argument presented in the source regarding government intervention, specifically its stance, which is described as very against government bailouts, particularly of banks, during financial crises.
Yes, this is where the source argues that well-intentioned interventions can actually prevent the necessary systemic learning and ultimately hinder the development of true anti-fragility in the financial system. By bailing out banks that have taken excessive risks and failed, you effectively shield them from the natural consequences of those failures.
Which prevents them from becoming truly robust, right? Or maybe prevents others from learning not to make the same mistakes. They might just continue taking unnecessary risks.
That's precisely the argument. The incentive structure gets distorted. If banks believe they're too big to fail and will ultimately be rescued by the government, likely using taxpayer money, they have significantly less incentive to be prudent, to manage risk effectively, to avoid accumulating bad loans or what the source might refer to as negative NPA, non-performing assets, essentially toxic debt that's unlikely to be repaid.
So, the government interference prevents the system from learning from the decentralized failures of individual institutions. The bad information doesn't get fully purged.
Correct. The contrast is made vividly with nature again. Nature doesn't typically bail out species that are struggling to adapt or prop up failing ecosystems indefinitely.
It lets things run their course.
It allows organisms, species, even entire empires or ecological niches to decay and disappear if they can't adapt to changing conditions. It doesn't have permanent administrations tasked with propping up failing components forever. The source views intervention as bailouts, particularly in finance, as a form of epistemic arrogance,
Epistemic arrogance, meaning
meaning a belief, perhaps misplaced, that central planners or governments know better how to manage these incredibly complex economic systems than the system itself can learn through the decentralized signals provided by both successes and failures. It overrides the system's own learning mechanism.
this brings us back then to that distinction the source makes between good systems and bad systems based on how they handle errors and fragility.
Right. Airlines are presented again as an example of good systems in this framework. They allow for, or perhaps tolerate, small, independent errors, individual plane crashes, component failures that are crucially negatively correlated.
Meaning one failure makes the next one less likely.
Exactly. Because the failure provides information that triggers system-wide improvements, better designs, stricter regulations, improved training. This reduces the likelihood of the next similar crash. The overall environment of air travel, the system itself, becomes anti-fragile because of the fragility of its individual units, and importantly, the effective capture and utilization of the information generated by their failures.
Globalized financial systems, however, are often presented in the source as potential bad systems in contrast. Why?
Primarily because in these highly interconnected systems, errors often don't remain localized. They can spread rapidly and compound through contagion. A failure in one major bank isn't necessarily isolated. It can trigger failures in other interconnected institutions due to counterparty risk, widespread panic, and a general loss of confidence that freezes up lending.
So every bank crash, rather than making the next one less likely, can actually make the next one more likely. Positive correlation of errors.
That's the danger highlighted. The failure propagates instead of leading to systemic strengthening.
So the goal then for an ideal socioeconomic system, according to the source's perspective, is to somehow eliminate that second type of error, the one that produces contagion, the systemic risk, the domino effect.
Precisely. You want a system that allows for, even encourages, decentralized, localized fragility and failure, because that's where the crucial learning happens, and the valuable information is generated about what works and what doesn't. But you simultaneously need robust firewalls or mechanisms to prevent that localized fragility from cascading into a full-blown systemic collapse. Good systems contain failures, bad systems amplify them.
Okay. This idea of systems being composed of levels where failure at one level can benefit another also ties into the mathematical concept of fractals and hierarchies, which the source touches upon, linking back to nature and markets.
Yes, absolutely. The source introduces the concept of fractals and self-similarity, building on the work of the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot. The classic, easy-to-visualize example is a tree.
Right, a branch looks like a smaller tree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Large branch looks like a smaller version of the entire tree, and then smaller branches growing off that look like even smaller trees, and so on. This pattern, this geometric self-similarity, repeats itself across different scales of observation.
And the source illustrates how this fractal nature, this self-similarity across different scales, is actually observable in things like financial market charts.
It's quite a striking observation. If you look at a chart showing the price movements of an asset, say gold or crude oil or maybe even Bitcoin, over a very long period, like 50 years,
Okay.
the patterns you see, the volatility, the trends, the sharp corrections, the periods of calm, might look remarkably similar in their overall character to a chart of the exact same asset over just 1 year or even 1 month, 1 week, or sometimes even a single day.
So you often can't tell the time frame you're looking at just by the general shape of the price pattern. The source mentions looking at gold prices over 55 years, where only 3 years were actually down overall, yet the shorter term movements within those years, over months or weeks, can have very similar looking patterns of steep drops and sharp rallies.
Exactly. This self-similarity across timescales isn't likely accidental. It suggests that similar underlying dynamics, probably driven by similar patterns of human behavior and market forces, things like fear, greed, reaction to news, herd behavior, are operating at these different levels of time resolution. The system has this inherent layered structure, and the behavioral patterns tend to repeat.
And biologically, of course, this layered hierarchy, where different levels operate on different timescales and with distinct properties, is incredibly evident and fundamental.
Absolutely. It's fundamental to life as we know it. You have the hierarchy, molecules functioning within cells, cells organizing into tissues, tissues forming organs, organs working together within organisms, organisms interacting within species, species making up ecosystems.
And the strengthening mechanism for a higher level, like the species adapting over generations through evolution.
Comes directly at the expense of fragility and turnover. At a lower level, individual organisms dying and being replaced by slightly different ones. The system improves by sacrificing parts.
Which leads us to another fascinating concept the source brings up: autophagy, which
Yeah.
is presented as a biological process happening within a single organism that seems to mirror this very idea of leveraging fragility for higher level strength.
Yes, autophagy literally translates to self-eating. It's a natural, essential cellular process where your cells break down and recycle their own damaged or dysfunctional components. Think old or misfolded proteins, worn out organelles like mitochondria. It's like an internal quality control and recycling program.
And when does this happen more?
It's particularly ramped up under conditions of stress, like starvation or nutrient deprivation. Your body increases autophagy to break down less essential or damaged cellular parts to provide energy and crucial building blocks, amino acids, fatty acids, to maintain vital functions and build necessary new components.
So it's like your body is conducting its own internal process of selection and disposal, getting rid of the weak stuff to survive.
That's exactly how the source presents it, as an evolutionary process within your systems.
Yeah.
Your body is, in a very real sense, selecting and killing off or recycling its weakest internal components, the fragile subunits within you, like specific old proteins or damaged cell parts for the overall fitness, health, and survival of the organism as a whole.
That's a really powerful analogy. So the organism strengthens itself by sacrificing or recycling internal parts, whereas species evolution is the species strengthening itself by sacrificing whole organisms.
Precisely. But the underlying principle leveraging fragility and removal at a lower level to benefit the integrity and function of a higher level is remarkably analogous. It just reinforces the idea that these layered mechanisms of dealing with damage, error, and senescence are fundamental across many types of complex biological and potentially other systems.
Okay, so taking this idea of markets as these layered, somewhat fractal systems, the source then delves into how information flows within them and how different participants interact within these layers, often exploiting the structures and dynamics present.
Right. Markets are incredibly complex systems, and while from the outside, most observers, maybe most retail traders, only see this surface layer, the price action moving up and down on a chart.
Yeah, the line graph.
There are much deeper layers of information, intention, and different types of participants operating beneath that surface. And these participants often have vastly different resources and advantages.
So the classic efficient market hypothesis, the idea that price discounts everything instantly, the source pushes back on that.
It acknowledges the reality of information asymmetry. While the price might reflect publicly available information to some degree, some participants think large institutions, sophisticated hedge funds running complex algorithms, maybe even central banks making policy moves, or hypothetically, individuals with non-public or insider knowledge clearly have a data advantage or a knowledge advantage.
They see or know things the average person doesn't.
Or they can process public information much faster and more effectively. Examples given might be reserve banks accumulating gold based on long-term strategic national policy decisions not immediately obvious to the market. Or, more controversially, hypothetical and often illegal, insider knowledge held by someone close to a political decision that could influence specific stock trades. This knowledge exists and operates at a deeper, less visible layer than the simple public price feed.
And auction markets are presented as one area where some of this deeper information, or at least the collective positioning and expectations of more informed participants, becomes somewhat more visible if you know how to read it.
Yes, the option chain itself is described as a fascinating snapshot. It shows the volume of contracts traded and the open interest, that's the total number of outstanding contracts that haven't been closed out for both calls, bets on price going up, and puts bets on price going down.
At different strike prices and expiration dates.
Exactly. By looking at the distribution of this volume and open interest across various strike prices at different expiration dates, you can sometimes get a sense of where large players are placing their bets, maybe establishing price floors or ceilings, or what level of future volatility they're anticipating and pricing in. It's like seeing a map of the collective intelligence, or perhaps more accurately, the collective risk exposure and expectations of market participants laid out numerically.
The source spends a significant amount of time detailing the perspective of the seller in financial markets, particularly someone selling options. Why is this perspective considered so crucial for understanding these layered markets?
This is presented as a key insight. The option seller is fundamentally positioned like an insurance provider. They sell a promise, the promise to either buy or sell an underlying asset, like a stock or commodity, at a specific strike price, but only if the buyer chooses to exercise the option before a certain expiration date.
And in return for selling this promise, this potential obligation.
They collect a premium upfront from the option buyer. Their core strategy often is to bet on things not happening, or at least not happening drastically. For instance, they might sell a call option, which is essentially selling the proposition that the underlying stock won't go significantly above a certain price by expiration. Or they sell a put option, betting it won't fall significantly below another price.
So it's like an insurance company betting that most houses won't burn down this year, or most drivers won't have a major accident. They're selling protection against events they calculate are relatively unlikely.
Precisely. They're essentially selling probability. Their business model relies heavily on data, statistics, and understanding probabilities over large numbers of trades. Much like an actuary at an insurance firm calculates risk exposure to set premiums profitably. They aim to collect more in premiums, on average, over time, than they have to pay out in losses when those improbable events they've insured against actually do occur.
And the source highlights that they benefit significantly from something called theta decay. What exactly is that?
Theta decay refers to the erosion of the time value component of an option's price as it gets closer to its expiration date. Every option premium has two main components: intrinsic value, if it's already in the money, and time value, the value based on the possibility it might become profitable before expiry.
And time value always decreases.
Yes, all else being equal, the time value inherently decays day by day, accelerating as the expiration date approaches. The source uses the analogy of a banana. Once you buy a banana, its potential value inherently decreases over time as it ripens and eventually spoils, regardless of what happens with the market price of other fruit.
So the option seller is on the winning side of this decay.
That's the idea. By selling the option, they collect a premium that includes this time value component. They then profit passively as that time value erodes each day. The option gets closer to expiration, assuming the underlying price doesn't move drastically against them. The source says they are effectively playing with speed, benefiting from the inexorable passage of time working against the option buyer's position.
So their goal isn't necessarily to perfectly predict the market's exact direction minute by minute.
Not always. It's often more about managing risk around probabilities and the certainty of time decay. They aim to structure their trades and set premiums in a way that gives them a statistical edge based on historical likelihoods and the guaranteed erosion of time value.
What's their main challenge then?
Their key challenge is managing the risk of those rare but potentially large market movements that do breach the strike prices they've sold insurance against. The source describes this as needing to be able to do firefighting at certain price levels, having sufficient capital and a pre-planned strategy to adjust their positions, perhaps hedge their risk, if the market moves strongly against them in order to survive the volatility without catastrophic losses.
So they have to keep their own mistakes, their losses on those adverse moves, small enough relative to the total premiums they collect over time to remain profitable overall.
Exactly. It's a game of managing probabilities and risk exposure over the long run.
This seems like a completely different world from, say, a passive investor who just buys a stock or an ETF and holds it for years, maybe decades, largely in concern with short-term timing or volatility.
It's a very different approach. The passive investor is largely ignoring speed and short-term timing. For the active option seller described here, speed, timing, volatility, and probabilities are everything. They're actively managing positions based on these factors, often over much shorter time horizons.
And the price of operating at this speed.
The price of trying to extract value from these complex dynamics is that you face potential penalties, potentially very large, rapid losses, if you are caught on the wrong side of a fast, significant market move that overwhelms your risk management.
So how does this complex world of option selling connect back to our core theme today? Anti-fragility emerging from the fragility of others or from systemic properties.
It's presented as another layer or example of the same underlying ideas playing out. The market system itself is seen as layered, maybe even fractal. The strategy of the sophisticated option seller, particularly when implemented systematically and with sufficient capital, think of large market makers or even reinsurance companies dealing in financial risk, aims for robustness or even anti-fragility in their overall profitability across a large portfolio of trades over time.
How so?
They benefit from the predictable fragility of time decay, of theta. They often implicitly benefit from the potential behavioral errors or informational disadvantages of less sophisticated market participants who might be buying options as lottery tickets, hoping for big, improbable moves. Their models rely on understanding the system's probabilistic behavior under stress and over time.
So they structure their positions to benefit from statistical edges and structural elements like time decay.
Right. They leverage insights about errors, the probable errors in prediction inherent in market prices, the potential behavioral errors of less disciplined traders, and crucially, they manage their own exposure to potentially catastrophic, but hopefully low probability, adverse market moves. It involves understanding errors, yours and others, and leveraging structural advantages within the system.
Okay, so pulling all these fascinating, sometimes quite disparate threads together now from, evolution and natural selection, ruthlessly sacrificing individual organisms for the sake of the gene pool, to the aviation industry learning and becoming safer through tragic crashes, the competitive struggle and failure of restaurants improving the overall dining scene, the warnings about financial bailouts potentially stifling systemic learning.
The fractal nature of markets reflecting patterns across scales, and even that internal biological process of autophagy recycling weak cellular components.
They all seem to illustrate different facets of how complex systems navigate randomness, uncertainty, and error. And consistently, a key mechanism appears to involve leveraging the fragility, the vulnerability, or even the outright failure of individual components, subunits, or specific events within that system.
That's the common thread.
Yeah.
And the concept of decentralized error seems incredibly powerful here. Good systems, as the source defines them, like the airline industry perhaps, or a healthy natural ecosystem, seem to allow for these smaller, independent, negatively correlated errors to occur.
Because they provide invaluable information.
Exactly. They act like distributed sensors, constantly reporting back on what doesn't work in the real world under real stress. This information helps prevent larger, more catastrophic, contagious failures down the line.
Whereas bad systems, maybe like the global economic system when it's prone to contagion, fail to isolate errors effectively.
Right. In those systems, fragility in one area can spread rapidly and compound, making the entire system brittle and prone to collapse, rather than resilient and capable of learning.
The source even briefly touches on observing natural learning mechanisms, like watching a leopard learn to hunt through trial and error, which don't seem to require external trainers or structured curricula in the way humans often do.
Yeah, it points towards the idea that some complex natural systems might have evolved these incredibly efficient, inherent, decentralized learning processes driven by experiencing and surviving errors at different levels of organization. Perhaps contrasting that with artificial human systems that often need much more explicit design, intervention, and formal knowledge transfer to learn effectively from failure.
So circling all the way back to the beginning, why should you, listening to this deep dive, care about this sometimes abstract, sometimes difficult concept of the power of other people's problems and layered anti-fragility? How does it connect to your world?
Well, I think understanding this fundamental mechanism can really change how you might interpret major events you see in the news, things like natural disasters, economic downturns, market crashes, technological failures. Are they only tragedies, purely negative events? Or could they also be seen as signals, however painful, that are vital inputs into a larger learning and adaptation process, a process that could potentially strengthen the overall system in the long run?
It could certainly change your perspective on personal or professional failures too, couldn't it? Both your own failures and those you witness in others. While failure is often painful, does it provide crucial information? Could it be a necessary, albeit difficult step that actually paves the way for future success or improvement for yourself, or maybe for your team or organization simply by revealing limitations or showing you what approaches are ineffective?
It also offers a powerful lens through which to analyze the complex organizations or markets you interact with every day. Where is fragility intentionally built into the system? Or where does it naturally reside? Where does the anti-fragility truly lie? What level of the system is benefiting from failures or pressures occurring at another level? Are the systems you depend on good systems with localized contained errors, or potentially bad systems prone to dangerous contagion?
And perhaps most personally, it offers a challenging perspective on risk, resilience, and maybe even your own place within the larger systems you're a part of. It forces a contemplation, doesn't it, of that inherent balance between individual survival and flourishing and the processes of collective adaptation and progress.
I think ultimately the core takeaway from all this material we've covered is that systemic strength, resilience, adaptation, and learning often emerge directly from individual vulnerability and decentralized failure. It's a hard truth, absolutely. It's often counterintuitive and can be emotionally very difficult to accept, especially when facing personal loss or witnessing tragedy up close.
Mm.
But it is presented here as a fundamental mechanism by which many complex systems, from the most natural, like ecosystems, to the most engineered, like aviation, or maybe even robust scientific methods, actually evolve, survive, and crucially improve over time. They improve by learning from what breaks, from what doesn't work.
It really forces you to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in your head at the same time, doesn't it? The immense pain and reality of individual tragedy and this more abstract, long-term statistical benefit to the larger system.
It does. And this raises a really important, maybe practical question for us. As we design and manage our own human systems, whether we're talking about financial regulations, technological development, public health policies, or even just organizational structures in our businesses,
Yeah.
how do we consciously try to build them?
How do we build them to harness that power of decentralized error and localized fragility for collective benefit and learning like we see in nature or aviation, while simultaneously doing everything we can to prioritize, support, value, and protect the individual units, the human lives within those systems? That's the challenge, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a profound challenge. Finding that balance, navigating that inherent tension between the fragile individual experience and the potentially anti-fragile collective outcome. So maybe the next time you see a failure, whether it's big or small, perhaps pause for a moment and ask yourself, what is the system learning from this? Who or what level is potentially becoming stronger because something else broke?
Something to think about.
Until the next deep dive.